Hello, everybody. Hi, Travis. Welcome to our panel discussion, Fossil Fuel Divestment, Climate Action or Climate Distraction, which is hosted by the UW-Madison Office of Sustainability as part of our 2022 Earth Week events. I just want to make a quick note here that this is currently streaming as a Zoom webinar. So we've got at least 20 people watching on Zoom right now. It's also being recorded, just FYI for you as you participate. I'm Nathan Yondel. I'm the Assistant Director at the Office of Sustainability and the organizer of this event. And I'm really grateful to all of you for being here, including those on Zoom. I'm also grateful to our panelists and moderator, whom I'll introduce momentarily, as well as to the Wisconsin Union and the Marquee Theater for this excellent space. So to set the stage a little, fossil fuel divestment has become a hot button topic on our campus and on campuses across the United States. At UW-Madison, we have seen resolutions brought by Campus Shared Governance, stipulating that the UW Foundation, a separate entity from UW-Madison that manages the endowment on its behalf, should divest its holdings from fossil fuels. There have been protests, demonstrations, and lately, a lot of orange hats showing up in important meetings to indicate support for a divestment. At the same time, conversation about divestment has become somewhat brittle. There have been precious few structured opportunities to discuss the topic, and folks on both sides of the argument tend to fall back on relatively simple claims. This keeps everyone at arm's length and not really discussing the complex underlying issues. So tonight, we're going to try to deepen the conversation. I do want to briefly set some expectations. In this event, we won't seek to determine whether UW-Madison should or should not divest. Instead, in the spirit of our university, we will sift and winnow the broader concept of fossil fuel divestment so that everyone leaves with a more informed and nuanced understanding of the issue, and maybe some ideas for how to move forward meaningfully and with a greater capacity for impact. With all of this in mind, I would ask that everyone maintain a spirit of openness, friendliness, and curiosity during this conversation. Divestment may be a divisive and sometimes emotionally intense topic, but we shouldn't prejudge each other based on our opinions in this space. Everyone I've spoken to on divestment, bar none, cares very much about this planet and about our climate, no matter their stance on whether divestment is a good idea or not. So let's just keep that in mind. All right, with that preamble, I'm going to introduce our panelists and moderator. Starting from the end, Ashley Chung is a second-year Posse Scholar in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, double majoring in conservation biology and community and environmental sociology. She serves as the Associated Student of Madison's Sustainability Committee Chair, where she organizes grassroots campaigns in coalition with student and community organizations to advocate for sustainability and justice on campus. She's a member of the UW-Madison BIPOC Coalition, where she engages with the broader Madison community to plan direct actions, amplifying underrepresented voices. Pranav Srivastava is a current senior at UW-Madison studying finance, economics, and art history. At UW, Pranav is passionate about institutional climate advocacy through his role as the 2022 senior class president. On campus, he's been focused on amplifying the efforts of his peers by partnering with the Green Fund, which is administered from the Office of Sustainability, for the 2022 senior class gift. Thank you, Pranav, and the whole senior class. After graduation, Pranav will take on a clean energy investment banking role focused on renewable development and climate tech in Houston, Texas. Steph Tai, so Pranav at the end here, Steph second from the end, is a law professor at UW-Madison studying the intersections between environmental, food, and health sciences and administrative law. Steph has a chemistry background, MIT undergrad and Tufts University PhD, and a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. Prior to teaching, they worked as the editor-in-chief of the International Review for Environmental Strategies, a law clerk to the Honorable Ronald Lee Gilman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and an appellate attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. They also represent amici and Federal Circuit Court and Supreme Court cases, including Massachusetts versus EPA, which was the first climate change case brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. From 2013 to 2014, Professor Tai served as a Supreme Court Fellow as a researcher in the Federal Judicial Center. And everyone keep coming in, we're just doing our introductions here. Paul Wilson in the center at the table is the Granger Professor of Nuclear Engineering and a current department chair of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department for Engineering and Physics. His research interests focus on developing improved tools for computational modeling of complex nuclear energy systems with applications in radiation shielding, nuclear waste management, nuclear non-proliferation, and energy policy. Paul joined the University of Wisconsin-Madison as an assistant professor in August 2001 as part of the Energy Systems and Policy Hiring Initiative. He received his undergrad degree in engineering science from the University of Toronto, a doctoral degree in mechanical engineering from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany in 1998, and a PhD in nuclear engineering and engineering physics from the UW-Madison in 99. And, no. Martha Goodell's fell off. Martha Goodell, would you like to introduce yourself from remotely?
That's pretty funny. Hi, I'm Martha Goodell. I have an MBA in finance. Spent 25 years in investments and management consulting, angel investing, and project finance. The project finance side was mostly in the renewables and sustainability sector over the last 7 or 8 years. And I was a graduate of the EAP program in the Nelson Institute, and I'm a current member on the advisory board of the Nelson Institute. That's a quick summary.
Thank you, Martha. My apologies. Printer issues, apparently. Finally, and Martha's joining us remotely. Thank you, Martha, for coming in from afar. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ann Turlock. She's an associate professor at the Wisconsin School of Business here at UW-Madison. She directs both a graduate certificate in business and sustainability at the School of Business and the undergraduate sustainability certificate at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Many of you may have that or getting it. For the last 10 years, she's been teaching classes on the challenges and solutions in business sustainability and holds a PhD from the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I will hand it over to Ann. Thank you.
All right. Good evening. Thanks for coming. To clarify what we're talking about tonight, divesting. Divesting essentially the opposite of investing. In our context here, it's the selling of shares that one might hold in fossil fuel companies. Related question then might be, where would we be reinvesting to help fight climate change? That's an interesting question, but not one that we will be addressing here. We'll be sifting and winnowing with respect to divestment and how we might view it as climate action or climate distraction. All right, the way we've set this up is I will, to frame the discussion, touch on 4 commonly made arguments, to then circle back to each of these arguments and have our panelists unwrap those further. All right? All right, so first set of arguments addresses financial markets. The idea here is that those who argue that divestment is climate action suggest that through divestment, we will be lowering the share prices of fossil fuel companies, essentially raising their cost of capital and limiting their growth and investment potential, defunding them, essentially, making them irrelevant. On the other side are those that say it's the divestment is climate distraction. Folks arguing that share prices actually won't be affected through divestment. Others will just pick up the shares, and that we might actually be more effective by keeping our investments to influence fossil fuel companies through active ownership. Second set of arguments, more of a moral perspective. Those that argue that that divestment is climate action suggest that there's a moral imperative to divest, that it is immoral to profit of something that wrecks our planet, and that higher ed institutions in particular have an imperative here, or have a moral imperative to divest, as they are thought leaders. On the other side are those that do not view fossil fuels as immoral or inherently evil, the way we might think of apartheid in the context of South Africa. And that they would suggest that if they were immoral. It would also be immoral to consume them, and that it would be a more logical consequence than to boycott the consumption of fossil fuels, especially as it relates to consumption out of convenience. Third set of arguments, also somewhat related to financial markets. Again, the idea here is that you should actually be divesting for financial reasons, that investment into fossil fuels exposes you to the risk of stranded assets and depreciation as economies worldwide are decarbonizing. On the other side are those that say, well, institutional investors in particular have the expertise and also every incentive to maximize returns, and that as the risks of fossil fuels no longer make sense in a risk return consideration, divestment will occur automatically, irrespective of whatever divestment movement there might be going on. Last set of arguments relates to a symbolic dimension, where those that argue divestment is climate action say ultimately it may just be a symbolic action. But climate change is perhaps the largest challenge that current and especially future generations face. And through divestment, we are shining a spotlight on the urgency of addressing climate change. Those on the other side would argue that then the challenge is so big that it requires substantive, not symbolic action. And that symbolic action crowds out substantive action because it comes with opportunity cost. It's resources spent on something that's symbolic as opposed to something that might be more substantive. In the context of higher ed and endowments, there is the concern from that side that this symbolic action comes with costs. If we are categorically excluding certain investment opportunities, we might limit the returns to the endowment and hence limit the ability of the endowment to support research and teaching in the space. And we might also lose donors and hence reduce funding, so lose donors that do not agree with this investment strategy, reduce funding and hence limit research and teaching opportunities there. All right, so that felt a little bit like speed dating. So let me go back to the first argument and hand it over to the panelists here. So the first argument being divestment as a climate action because it will defund the fossil fuel industry versus it won't work. Shareholders won't budge, others will just pick it up, and shareholder activism is a more effective strategy. Martha, let me turn it over to you first, given that this is a little bit your expertise field. You're muted.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone. And thanks, Anne, for the intro. Well, I'm going to do a quick overview just to clarify for the audience, because I think it matters to a lot of the conversation. So divestment is a sale of an asset. Usually it's related to a subsidiary of a company. With shareholder activism, the divested asset is a share of stock, and that share is driven by the stockholder. So just for clarification, as you mentioned, South Africa, also Sudan in 2006, people were divesting in stocks and from that country. I also want to state at a high level for the conversation, I don't have a universal opinion on whether divestment through shareholder activism is the right or the wrong way to impact the trajectory of a company. It's more of an independent decision related to the matching of the goals of the activism with an understanding of the ramifications. Divestment can have a substantial positive intended impact and also unintended consequences. I also really think that it's not an either or conversation, in my opinion. If it's more climate resilience we want, then shareholder activism needs more tools. So I see divestment as one option in a set of options with respect to shareholder activism. I think that's very important to delineate because a lot of people say, should you or shouldn't you? Well, there's 4 or 5 different ways shareholder activism can influence the trajectory of a company. And I actually think, it depends on the situation, which is more powerful. So for more direct response to Anne's question, paraphrasing, how not divesting can have more influence. I think that's people can see a lot of evidence especially back from the 70s and 80s, and a lot of universities divesting and having a powerful impact. But where can not investing have more influence? So we can look at 2021 for the proxy fight that occurred with Exxon. So an activist hedge fund called Engine Number One decided that they felt that it was more powerful at an activist level to submit four names to the board of directors to become board of directors members and then therefore impact the trajectory of the company. What they did was they did a smart way of going about it. Not only did they have the right people involved, but they went to some institutional investors, namely BlackRock, Vanguard, and I think State Street. And they went to those institutions and said, here's who we're submitting as names to the board. And surprising to Exxon and actually a lot of other people, that shareholder vote won. And so they then became actually three of the four potential board members were elected. And now you look back over the last year and you see a substantial change in the way Exxon looks at carbon emissions reductions, investing more into carbon neutral products and services. So it's one of those really powerful, very high exposure situations where if Engine Number One had divested, they wouldn't have had a seat at the table. And I think that's one of the most powerful examples with respect to what the second part of Anne's comment is, where is there a better influence by not investing? We often see divestment as a strong tool, but not where not investing would have been more powerful. Would have been more powerful in this situation if they didn't have a seat at the table and had an influence. That change might not have occurred at the corporate level. So I've got some other thoughts, but I think it relates to one of the other questions. So that's my
one follow-up question there before we hand it over to another panelist. When you say that divestment has proven to be effective in other contexts, you brought up South Africa and Sudan. My understanding has been that it was effective, but not via actually influencing financial markets, but via shining the spotlight on the issue. That so financial markets did not respond. It was not through a defunding mechanism of defunding. I should be looking there, not there. Defunding the companies. Is that your, as someone in the industry, is that your understanding as well, or how do you see that?
I would say I would delineate the difference between share price impact and defunding, because defunding is such an ambitious goal. And I think it's actually not a valid goal, but that's a whole nother conversation. I would actually say affecting the share price, which actually has happened in some of the energy companies. Their cost of capital has been higher. They've struggled to keep share prices at a PE ratio related to the industry as a whole, the economy as a whole. So I would say it's actually both. It has financially impacted these companies, and they have to go out and pay 5.5% on their cash float rather than 3.5%. So that's an impact, and it is a risk, which is related to one of your other questions. But I also think it has been advantageous or a good thing or beneficial from a climate perspective when looking at the increased conversation around the subjects. And that also relates to a lot of your other questions. So I think financial markets, it's really difficult to look at that impact, positive impact or whatever in a vacuum.
Thank you. Do we have another panelist wanting to comment on that or elaborating further?
So I wanted to reiterate the point that Martha just made about the ways that active shareholders can be causes for change. Some of those shareholder activism kind of things was represented by a former law professor of mine. And also the SEC now has a new disclosure rule. The new disclosure rule is basically disclosing a lot of different climate risks and also sort of fossil fuel investments, a large number of things. It's been quite controversial, but this disclosure will allow for more grounds of sort of active management if that's the way that you want to go. But the key is that without divestment, but also without active management, nothing's going to happen on that front. It needs that kind of sort of management, internal management that Martha's mentioned. But there are opportunities for that, and there are growing opportunities for that given the new SEC regulation.
We have a bit of time to dig a little deeper on this particular aspect. So help me wrap my brain around it. So we want to do both. We want to divest, we believe, helps, as well as active ownership. Now, wouldn't there be a concern that if we divest, it falls those who are, that would have to be coordinated quite a bit, that those who pick up the shares are those that are also interested in active, no, okay, Martha wants to say something, go.
I actually look at it from a time perspective. This is Martha's personal perspective on all this. Just because you have divestment that occurs in an industry early on to increase awareness doesn't mean that the decision 5 years in is to do both, is that divestment is the decision to do now. I think those decisions can be independent. So I think it's the fact that a small university that has decides to divest causes more awareness. That's not going to affect the stock price. Over time, the stock price is impacted, but then there's a tipping point where divestment is no longer as beneficial or as powerful. It is that more active participation at the board level, at investing in new opportunities that company is going to want to buy into. I see it as a time continuum of decisions, not necessarily that you do it both at the same time.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next point, 2 more thoughts on this. And I know that I'm supposed to just be the moderator, not the panelist. I should just shut up, but I can't. So what I sometimes hear folks say is that this additional attention that it draws to the issue may be marginal, in the sense that climate change is on everyone's mind already. It's something that we struggle with every day. So that is something that I sometimes hear folks say, that, yeah, we need to consider the marginal impact here of this, the incremental increase in attention drawn to this. One other thing I wanted to point out is, and that relates to the shareholder activism argument, there is often this idea that it's reserved for those that have investable wealth, for the ones at the top. Only they can take enough shares to sort of have a voice. The activist fund that Martha mentioned, they owned 0.02%?
0.02.
2% of Exxon, teeny share. And there's also certain organizations that actually coordinate individuals like us that don't have much wealth, where you would purchase a share, become a shareholder, you get coordinated through that organization that represents your voice. So in shareholder meetings, they present the voices of 10,000 people who each own 1 share. Still a teeny fraction of the ownership, but it is a voice to influence the shareholder discussion. Let's move on to the second argument, the moral dimension of this, the immorality of profiting off of something that literally wrecks the planet, versus the notion that maybe fossil fuels are not inherently, and fossil fuel use is not inherently immoral. And if it were immoral, is divestment actually the right thing to do here, or should there be other things? Ashley, do you have thoughts on that?
On. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. In case you didn't hear, I'm Ashley. I'm second year studying conservation biology and community environmental sociology here. So I'm just a student. I'm not even 20, but I'm here, and I'm sitting here because this matters, not just like in terms of economics or in terms of like what's best for the university, but like in terms of like my life and all of your lives. Because at the end of the day, like the idea of fossil fuel divestment is, the underlying question is about morality and like what do we value and like what do we put our time and our energy and our resources into, and what is that being invested in? It's not just about like money and the way this university operates. This is about like, as human beings, what are we putting our time and energy and effort into? And so there's like moral imperative here for basically like, because like this matters to our human lives. It's not just about like the planet, obviously it is, but like we live on this planet, we depend on this planet. And so like how we use this planet really matters. And so I don't know, in terms of like value systems, I think that the pandemic really like made us stop and think and reflect on like what are we really doing here with our lives? Like there was a lot of like protests over George Floyd and like the deaths of all of these like people who just didn't deserve to die. And like that's because of the way our society is structured. And that's like that same questioning of like what are we valuing? What are we putting our money and our time into is the same here in fossil fuel divestment. The fossil fuel industry is extremely just like horrible. Like there are so many like the missing and murdered Indigenous women who are like just who yes that exist are this issue is being perpetuated by the fossil fuel industry. And like there are disproportionate sightings of fossil fuel plants and like mining and stuff like that in communities that like don't deserve this. And this is having real impacts on real people. This is not just about like the money itself and the fuel itself. And this is why like we should care about this. And this is and everything is connected. Like I feel like when we talk about fossil fuels, we don't think about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. We don't think about the disproportionately impacted communities like in Flint, Michigan, where most of the people impacted were poor and were Black. Like that's because, not that specific, but like all of this environmental degradation is because like we here at UW are complacent in that. And like this touches every single one of our lives. Like in 2020, the WFAA had 129,991,444. Wait, I can't even read the number. Okay, basically $130 million invested in fossil fuels in 2020. That is a lot of money, even if it's like a very small portion of our endowment, that's still a lot of money to like you or me. And that money, I read this off of like the budget report from like 2020 or something, but it's used for need-based financial aid. It's used for facilities, innovation, and enriching the academic experience, whatever that means. But like, that's us, like need-based financial aid, that is students. That money that is being made profiting off of fossil fuel industry, off of violence, is funding our educations here. And that's like most of us, a lot of people in this room and at this university are like here because of financial aid.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. We discussed how let's wrestle with that issue of divestment or not on a more general basis. We decided to not specifically focus on should the UW Foundation divest or not.
Okay.
Any more thoughts?
I can just stop there.
You can just stop there. Do we have someone who wants to add on and maybe engage in the conversation there?
Yeah, so, I think this question of morality is very complex. Ashley has laid out a lot of moral questions that we face as a society. I have a number of thoughts on divestment as a moral issue. Climate change is clearly a moral issue. The fact that the earth is changing and individuals are having their countries taken away, their lives taken away, that is a moral issue. But there's not a lot of debate about whether or not climate change is a bad thing or a good thing, and it makes it easy to find a moral case there. Fossil fuels are certainly contributing to that, and they're contributing to many of these other ills that Ashley brought up. There's other moral questions related to fossil fuels, environmental justice questions. But all of us are on a daily basis extracting value from fossil fuels, where our lives are benefiting from fossil fuels. Somebody rode in an ambulance today to the hospital and was powered by fossil fuels. And so imagining that we can just wipe the earth of fossil fuels and not use them immediately is really not a moral question. I'm also frequently concerned by the connection of divestment as a concept, as a movement in the fossil fuel context to questions like apartheid or Sudan. I mean, those are situations. And when we talk about morality, there are gradients. There is a spectrum of morality. And the moral questions of the South African regime leading up through apartheid and the moral questions of what was happening in Sudan about individual people as concerted and directed efforts oppressing and causing genocide and oppression to other individual groups of people is a very different and very extreme moral case where symbolic motion, symbolic efforts like divestment may make a lot of sense. The fossil fuel industry is a much more complicated situation. It's a situation, as I already said, we're all extracting value from it on a day-to-day basis. It's one of the industries that has the resources to actually make changes in our energy system, given the resources that its investments may have. And we've seen it happening both, not just through the activism of shareholders, but even prior to that, some of these industries have seen the writing on the wall and have been making investments in other kinds of technologies and moving to clean energy. And so I think that there are deep moral questions that we should be grappling with. Climate change is one of them. Environmental justice, both from the fossil fuel industry as well as many other energy industries, is another one. But whether or not we should be blaming fossil fuel industry for all of it by itself and declaring it a moral bad is I think not the right way to go.
So the way I kind of think about this is like, if you think about in a global landscape, with a rising population globally, rapidly expanding middle class globally, the use of fossil fuels is essential. I mean, we operate our entire lives based off of fossil fuels right now. So yeah, it is exactly, improbable to, reduce or to completely cut use of fossil fuels immediately. However, we as an institution do have a moral obligation to fight towards a better tomorrow. And that includes, an effort of divestment. To touch on morality more directly, as an institution, I mean, if we look at the history of the fossil fuel industry, if we're looking at, the past 50, 60 years of, what this industry has done to perpetuate climate change and to perpetuate misinformation campaigns, that's the morality piece that we can easily say, why would we want any business to do with these companies? Like, yes, they are very much leading the transition to renewables because they have the existing capital to do so. But again, if you look at that point, that's a very convenient argument for them to make, to say, hey, like, you shouldn't be divesting from us because look at all the good research we have, on our side. When in reality, they're going to continue extracting and juicing every dollar they can from the oil reserves that they hold. So that's the morality component that really strikes me and says, well, I mean, if you look at, financial opportunities, we're not seeing outsized returns from investing in fossil fuel companies. Okay, you're not seeing 10 to 15% returns on these companies relative to ahead of the broader market. The fact is, you can achieve similar returns by investing elsewhere. I think that itself is enough reason to say, hey, like, why would we want to actively participate with these companies when we can achieve similar returns elsewhere?
We have some elevator music in the background here. Oh. Martha, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'll have a context that kind of wraps a lot of this through. And I'd like to go on the inherently evil side of it. And I look at these companies as, how should I say it? Really just feedstock and offtake. So if you look at traditional refinery, your feedstock is oil, your offtake is gas, petrochemicals, plastics, all the same. Well, what if you had a biofuel facility that was the feedstock, the inputs was switchgrass, and the offtake was a very clean fuel? So you lowered your carbon footprint by 95%. That processing is done by the exact same companies that currently are fossil fuel companies. They have the decades and decades of experience, not just only making fuels and have a distribution channel, but understanding really how to get those funded. So they have large balance sheets. They're able to do a lot of different projects and diversify their investment base on all these projects. And I spent probably the last 7 years, helping to de-risk these sustainable and renewable projects. And if you look at it from the lens of these companies just are trying to match the correlation of their feedstock and their offtake, which you can do if you've got an oil company. So they've got oil, it's priced coincident or correlated with their offtake. If you look at it, not inherently evil, but that's a model that needs to process biofuels, that needs to take wood pulp and make biofuels. I've had that kind of project I look at. So if you don't look at the evil side, which I totally agree, they've had decades of misinformation, accelerating our negative carbon footprint. Let's look at them as a balance sheet that can be adjusted to process more efficient, lower carbon alternatives. And that's why my whole job every day is to help de-risk these projects for institutional investors. And I have to look at it that way, that, let's convince them and show them that we still need that balance sheet. We just need to do it, process other types of technologies, more sustainable, renewable, et cetera. So the evil side, I think, is the actors, not the models.
Thank you. If we have time towards the end, maybe we can touch back on this notion that if with the role that we play as consumers in consuming and driving the value of something that potentially is immoral in some folks' views, because I think we play a role there too. We play the role really to drive the value here. Let's go on to the next set of arguments here. Divestment as a financial imperative, this notion that is actually it should be in the institutional investors' interest to divest because of the risk of the exposure to stranded risks. Steph, do you want to follow up on that a little bit?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I'm going to just be fully disclosing this. I was one of the co-drafters of the Faculty Senate resolution on divestment. And I wanted to disclose this because I also wanted to disclose something else. I was not part of the initial faculty movement on divestment. There was an earlier round that did not get passed. I was not involved in that. I became involved because I became involved in the part that Anne was just talking about, which is the consumer side of things. For example, one thing I study is procurement and procurement provisions. And I work with a number of companies that are trying to green basically them acting as customers. So establishing sustainable supply chains that rely more on electricity, less on fossil fuels, really just greening themselves. And this is done for a number of potential reasons, but they're doing this for pragmatic side. Some of these companies don't care anything about the environment. They don't actually have even a great track record on other aspects of the environment, see Walmart, but they're moving to sustainable energy for financial reasons. And that led me to think about the sort of risk of continuing to invest in these types of technologies that active companies, like processing companies, et cetera, are moving away from. And so it seems to me the argument for lowered financial risk was compelling enough for me to sort of be part of this resolution, not because of sort of, and also because of the additional studies that have come out that show that there's relatively little risk in terms of divestment, and moreover, increased financial exposure to risk in terms of continuing to invest in this. And I see this in my practice as a lawyer and a law professor, in that I follow a lot of the new regulatory policies that come out, the number of lawsuits. For example, we just talked about the sort of failure to disclose all of this information about contributions to climate change coming from fossil fuel companies. They've been investigated by the House of Representatives this year. And there's like, I think 16 lawsuits from states seeking damages from these companies on the basis of fraud. And they're being brought by attorneys generals in different states. This is a large financial risk for people who continue to invest in it. So I do come at it from the risk side, and it's based upon my experience from the consumer side of things. I'm happy to talk more about it, but I probably rambled on too long.
Thank you. Pranav, you're a finance student. Do you want to add to that, or?
No, as I mentioned before, I mean, if you were attaining outsized returns from investing in traditionally fossil fuel heavily engaged companies, then there's a more, I would say, adequate argument to say we should continue investing in these companies because they have the best means to achieve the clean energy transition. But that's not the case. You're not seeing those outsized returns, and if you can achieve similar returns elsewhere, or in my opinion, if you can achieve the potential outsized returns from investing in more of those clean energy projects that are also available, that is financial. That there is your financial imperative within the Wisconsin Foundation, where you have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns. I don't think making investments in a dying industry is prudent. I think you can achieve those similar returns elsewhere, so do so.
I'm not a finance major. That said, I think the general argument there is often that to categorically exclude a whole class of investments, because it's not only divesting now where it's perhaps not as return-wise as profitable, although I thought they've been doing pretty well, the oil and gas sector, for better or worse. It is also to categorically exclude them from future divestment opportunities as you are trying to balance out a huge portfolio of investments, right? And sort of balance the risk return there. I think that is the underlying concern for, and where if it was true that they categorically do not deliver the return for the risk return analysis, it doesn't make sense. You're saying they would be divesting anyway. It's kind of what you said. The fiduciary duty would push them to divest, right? So are we thinking they're just not? Huh? Paul, you say that.
I mean, I think the conclusion Anne is teasing out here is that, I mean, you really were questioning then the investment strategy of the foundation overall. If we don't think that they're working to maximize their investments, then I think there's all kinds of other sectors we could be worrying about and concerned about. So I think, it's interesting to me the way that we juxtapose on this third issue, the idea of risk to stranded assets versus the market taking care of it. If we believe that whoever is managing whichever investments of ours that we hold, whether it's the university or any other, then we have to believe that we hope, we engage them, I hope, to trust them that they are also assessing these risks and assessing whether or not these risks are actually real and whether the investments they've made are subjected to these risks relative to other investments they make.
Let me also add to that. My hope is that these risks are being considered. Part of the problem is that there's no way for outsiders to really assess whether that's being considered. And given the track record, for example, of fossil fuel companies directly lying to the public, it's a more understandable concern not to invest in trust without some kind of demonstration of that. And I'm not accusing the foundation of anything. Indeed, they might be minimizing their fossil fuel investments already a lot. And I understand that they've signed non-disclosure agreements saying that they can't disclose certain types of investments that are actively managed. I get it. I teach contracts. I understand non-disclosure agreements, but at the same time, the ask of trust is a lot given the history of the fossil fuel industry.
All right, thank you. Again, let's keep it in the general space here. Last set of arguments. We have a few minutes left here. Going back, and it was touched upon before, this notion that perhaps it is worth it as a symbolic action in and of itself, regardless of whether it actually affects fossil fuel companies and their ability to, and their financial standing or situation. And then the counter to that the symbolic action would then be a symbolic one potentially crowding out substantive action. on multiple fronts. One would be that we just draw away resources, the whole movement draws away resources that otherwise could be spent on maybe greening campuses or something like that, as well as the notion that are we limiting the support that we could otherwise get from the foundation, either by, and so there are costs there then, because there's a support that we then can't use for research and teaching in this field, for example. What are thoughts here? Do we have someone that that wants to speak to that? Paul, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, and I've touched on some of them already, and I feel a need to say that I'm not opposed to divestment on principle. I'm coming out on one side of these arguments, but I think that it's the point of this evening is to get at these nuances, and I'm quickly realizing we're going to run out of time to really get to the nuance part of this. But on this topic, I think again, I'm going to come on the side that the resources, so symbolic actions. I think doing something symbolic is just not enough. Climate change is a real problem, and the time for symbolic action has moved to the history. And it's as a university, as an institution of higher education, while on the one hand we see these arguments that we should be leading the way on these moral and symbolic arguments, we often are maligned for not being real and actually making real contributions to things. And so I think that we should be focusing more on how we can actually be making changes, how we should be looking to help develop and foster technologies that are actually going to move us beyond this, move us away from fossil fuels, because it becomes the best choice. Move us into technologies that will remove carbon from the atmosphere through direct air capture. I'm an engineer, so I'm going to look at the technological ones, but move us towards policy decisions and policy instruments, and invest that symbolic energy in seeking changes to policy, not divestment policies of our investment portfolios, but policies of our governments, policies of our institutions about the way that they're actually doing things, and change the way that they're doing things rather than in this symbolic way. So I think that symbolism is not a good reason to be doing this. I'll loop back quickly to something Martha said, and I think that this is not just a time-bearing problem, but it's a precise issue. There may be certain situations where there's a particular corporation that is worthy of removing your investment because of the actions, both the historic actions that have just been brought up, or immediate actions or current actions. But then they may change their actions and be worthy of investment again in the future. Or they may be in the process of changing their actions today, and it's worthy of investing in them to continue and incentivize that continued change in action. And so I really like Martha's framing of this being sort of a time evolution, and we shouldn't look at it as a one-time decision. I think the same is true going back to this sort of financial imperative, that this risk exposure question sort of plays in the mind as if there's a single investment decision that gets made today and we leave it sitting for 30 years. I mean, these are actively managed and time-varying decisions. And there should be situations where we're removing our investment dollars in certain places because it's the right thing to do for a whole host of reasons. And there should be places where we're putting those investments into companies that may be fossil fuel companies because they're making decisions and changing their business practices in ways that are the right thing to do. So I think that as you were just saying, Anne, about cutting out a whole sector, is a distraction from the ability to have the flexibility to wield our investment dollars if we think that they are meaningful, which is the presumption of the first argument. If we think they're meaningful, to wield them in ways that allow us to influence the change we want to see and how things are being done.
Let me give a counterexample, though, to how symbolic action can lead to concrete action. There is absolutely no way the Faculty Senate resolution would have gotten passed that included the procurement resolution without having a divestment. Nobody likes the term procurement. They think it's boring. I love it. But that would not have gotten passed. If we just initiated a procurement resolution, no one would have signed on. They would have been like, what? And then tabled it. Instead, we got the Faculty Senate to sign on to that because it was a rider. And now our Sustainability Office is actively working on greening our procurement. That is something that's happening. So I don't agree that symbolic action can't lead to substantive action. We have only, like at this point, 8 years left. We do need to do everything we could do. And that can include both symbolic action, substantive action, all that at once. I worked on this. I worked on policy level changes. I've worked on procurement kind of things. I'm working all the angles, and we can all do that.
I'd like to add on to that because I think that like, why can't we have both? Like, why can we not have symbolic action and substantive action? Like, why does it have to be, we have to choose one thing or the other? Because at this point, like, it is a time sensitive issue and like, we can't just like do one thing. We have to be doing everything we can to be stopping climate change. And so like, even if divestment is largely symbolic, like that is still something we're doing. And like every small thing counts in this case. And it doesn't have to be a choice between like symbolic or substantive action.
I think just because it's really hard to just be a moderator. I think we have to consider does this symbolic action come at the cost of substantive action? And if that's the case, then we have to have some tough questions to answer, right? And see if maybe at this time the symbolic action is no longer the right thing to do.
And that's why I provided the counterexample of where it actually led to substantive action versus given the cost of it, and it can.
Yeah, I've struggled to see the full analogy with the symbolic part there, but we can take this offline.
So it wouldn't have been, the resolution and the commitment to reducing that wouldn't have been signed onto were it not for the symbolism of divestment resolutions happening around the country. This led to it being recognizable as a form of address by the Senate, and therefore also included all of these other activities in terms of the commitment. And that wouldn't have been available without the symbolic nature of divestment happening around the country. Does that make sense?
No, not to me, but Paul was nodding, so it seems to be my issue.
Well, so let me say what I'm hearing Steph say is that the procurement action, which is substantive, was buried in the symbolism of a divestment action. And without the divestment action, it would have not been compelling to get support to pass the procurement action alone. So it became this jacket, this trench coat that you put around the procurement, or maybe coat of many colors is a better analogy, that you wrapped around the procurement issue to get it to be exciting and interesting enough for the faculty senate who were predisposed to this divestment question to pass this piece of substantive action that would otherwise have lingered and sort of laid fallow. Make more sense?
A little bit. So it's not crowding out here. You're giving an example of not crowding out. All right. I know that there are some listeners online let's open it up to questions. Here you go. I'm going to turn on this mic, or I'm going to give you my mic. Who has a question?
Well, I'll say it from down here. First of all, thank you, everybody. So the one question here that I think there's been a couple of comments that have come in through the Q&A, and I think the one question that I would sort of put to everybody, I'll read this out. Divesting in fossil fuels as UW-Madison, an extremely large public university, sends a message about their stance on the matter. And I also highly doubt UW is at the table, and I think this is the kernel of the question for you all. I also highly doubt UW is at the table making an impact at shareholder meetings in a more positive way than they can by divesting. So how can we argue against the logic of divestment? The goal should be to negatively affect the stock price of these companies. This helps us move in a positive direction and invest in cleaner energy is more impactful on our future. So I think the question is about maybe, and we are trying to stay away from UW-Madison as the sort of the sole example here, but it is an interesting point. It's a large institution, and yet to what extent can we have shareholder action, maybe lacking examples like Anne gave of these kind of aggregated actions, or maybe like Martha gave of the little engine that did. So it's sort of a proposal to talk about more than a question.
Yeah, no, I definitely do agree that, I mean, UW-Madison's decision to divest may not even move the needle on a share price. And I don't think that's really the goal. For me, symbolism is really the floor, the bare minimum floor of what we could be doing. And within this climate challenge, where you need to see governments make changes, where you need to see all the way from governments to institutions to the private sector to individuals, all these individuals need to make robust changes. This, in my opinion, is kind of I know it's not UW specific, but this is the UW Foundation's potential one small little contribution that they can make in this systemic change. Moreover, it's a matter of where do these dollars then go to? I know this is not a reinvestment discussion, but it's a matter of where can we take our dollars out of right now, and does that actually change the meter at all? And I think in this case, I think a symbolic statement saying UW-Madison is divesting from heavily engaged fossil fuel related companies is a headline. That's a headline that might even get onto the table of some individual at an ExxonMobil, right? Rather than us trying to try our very best from a shareholder activism standpoint, which I don't even think we really have the infrastructure going to do that right now. So it's a matter of yes, where can we make the largest impact right now as a university, and then as a foundation, and then like I said, divestment is really in one eye it is symbolic, but symbolism is really like the bare minimum of what we're trying to achieve here.
Martha, go ahead.
Oh, you can either one. Okay. I would go back to what I said kind of in the beginning, which I think it's kind of hard to come back to and put in the context, but the question inferred that the shareholder that is the university is, I wrote down the words, isn't doing anything in a positive way just by holding the shares. Therefore, we must divest to have a positive impact. That infers that the only way you can impact the company is by divesting. And I would say that there's 4 or 5 ways to be an activist in a company, including engine number 1 and other examples. I would also say related to that is merely voting shares differently. I read something like 30% of the shares that are held in a company are held by individuals, and only 20% of those individuals even vote their shares. So there's other ways to be an activist and actively vote a certain way. It's like we vote for president. What percentage even votes for president? So the question infers just by holding the shares, we're not doing anything good. Therefore, we must be doing good by divesting. That infers that there's not other vehicles and tools you can use. Again, I'm not saying that in certain situations, it might be very valuable. I like what Professor Wilson said about apartheid and very targeted specific investments that can be unwound, but there's a lot of other tools in the shed.
Can I mention something? If we do want to engage in the route of active management in terms of working with companies to reduce their climate impacts, I am happy to put any institution in touch with some of the leading attorneys in the country on that topic.
I'll just briefly say that, we're trying to abstract this away from the foundation. And I think it's a different conversation about what the foundation is or isn't doing with its investment dollars and how we're doing those things. On the topic of symbolism, I'm not convinced that this university divesting from fossil fuels is actually going to have a lasting symbolic impact. I agree. I hear what Steph says about the symbolic impact of helping get other measures passed. But if we were to make the decision today to divest of ourselves of fossil fuels, a month from now, it would no longer be making any headlines. But the active things that we get to continue doing would be continuing to make headlines. And so I think the symbolism would be a flash in the pan kind of symbolism. It would happen once, it'd be a headline, we'd be buried in all the headlines of other institutions that are doing the same thing. And then suddenly it would just be the future and we would be moving on and doing other things. And so focusing on those issues that have a lasting impact and have a growing impact, I think is more important.
Okay. I think that the notion of if a university divests, that gets lost in headlines and it happens once. I don't think that's necessarily like that's one way of looking at it, but also like if you take into context, like, yes, all of these institutions are doing that, like that sends a bigger message that I think has a greater effect and not necessarily like a smaller effect. Because like everyone doing the same thing at the same time, I think does have a pretty significant impact on the world and like what people are seeing. Like in my life science communications class, we learned about constant ubiquitous messaging and like the power that has. And so I think like when individual institutions are all saying the same thing at the same time, like that's indicative of like a grander message.
Thank you. I like how you're bringing the class. It's awesome. I have a question. Does someone else have a question? If so, I'll hand it over to them. If not, I have a question actually. Do you have a question there?
I just don't really know how to word this, but I think a lot of people agree that divestment isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. But like recent IPCC reports and like the university commitment to being like 100% renewable, like shouldn't there be like more urgency? I guess it doesn't seem like there isn't right now. Like divestment or moving towards renewable energy.
I will be at the front of the queue for us to move towards cleaner energy as university, right? I mean, I think there should definitely be more urgency on that. 10 years ago, we built a brand new natural gas power plant down the road. It's much better than the coal power plant that was there before, but we could be doing better than that as well. And so I think those are the kind of actions that are substantive, that are lasting, that are durable, and that will make a real difference of what this campus is doing. And these are the kind of questions that Professor Tai is talking about on procurement. That's one of the procurement decisions that unfortunately we don't get to make because we're part of the state government is where we get our energy. And so the ability for our campus to be consuming different energy sources would be a much bigger substantive and symbolic action than divestment from fossil fuels, I believe.
Yeah, I just have a quick follow-up question. So if we want to be completely renewable by XYZ year, is investing in fossil fuel companies, if we're still invested in them by our set goal date, which if we don't divest, are we still technically 100% renewable? Are we meeting our goals if we stay in these fossil fuel companies? I guess I'm just asking as like an outside perspective.
So I think we need to separate campus operations, UW-Madison, from the foundation, which is a totally separate entity. You're referring to the specific context of UW-Madison right now, is that correct? Yeah. And so in my view, if let's say we were to get campus on renewable energy, 100% renewable by a certain date, that would imply we are 100% natural renewable energy. What the foundation does is a completely separate question. They're just investing donor money to use the returns to support our operations. That is independent of how we operate campus. Does that make sense? So these are two different things. One is not related to the other, in my view.
And the other thing too to recognize, they are. I agree with you. They're absolutely separate institutions. So when we say we mean University of Wisconsin. The foundation is a separate organization that's structured under state law. That said, for us to move to 100% renewables takes a lot of political work and regulatory work because that isn't our decision.
And so it's just easy to ask for the foundation to divest. It's
Right.
less work for us.
No, I'm doing the work. I'm doing procurement work. So that's not just that. So I do take a little bit of offense with that because I'm not just trying to do one thing. But the same thing is that takes political work. And so to the fact that students want to focus their energy somewhere, political work is important. Even if you've given up on politics because you're fed up with politicians, it still is important because those are the strictures that we have to work under as a state agency.
Thank you. Okay, so last year, there was an attorney general complaint created by several groups that kind of banded together. And we received a response from the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions this year, which was very much in support of the complaint. However, the departments that we were calling on to kind of enforce the Wisconsin Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act had no jurisdiction due to the Wisconsin state constitution in actually enforcing this act, which we were arguing that the WFAA was violating. And I just want to know how you all respond to having governmental support of this complaint and of divestment. And I don't know, I was just curious on your thoughts on that.
Law person. So no, so I think that, yeah, so it is due to some unusual parts of the Wisconsin state constitution and laws that aren't present in other states. So for example, a similar kind of thing was filed in Massachusetts, where they asked the Massachusetts Attorney General to investigate, some of this stuff and whether or not the decisions were fiscally prudent. We don't have that ability in the state. There might be other kinds of avenues around that, but due to these differences and the uniqueness of our Wisconsin legal system, there isn't that option. Moreover, our state attorney general's hands have been tied in a lot of different areas from ways, and this is why voting matters. So that's where you might see in other states similar complaints being filed and them working, but that's because those states have different state laws, basically.
All right, another question from the Zoom. Thank you, folks who are participating in the Zoom. I'm going to talk you through this question. There's a few different pieces to it, but I think it makes an interesting argument. So if fossil fuel companies will continue to receive investments and have the infrastructure and resources to play a large role in our energy future, regardless of what UW-Madison does or doesn't do, then doesn't the divestment conversation become largely symbolic? If so, and if it is largely symbolic, one way or the other, i.e. it doesn't make a bit of difference to the climate change narrative, then shouldn't ethics and morals and justice govern the decision? In other words, if we can't make a difference, then shouldn't we take a stand?
I'm just the moderator. Martha, right on. Martha, you go.
Well, I think that assumes that the future of those companies is worse or the same as the past. I think one of the things that we haven't talked much about is investment theory and pricing of securities in the public markets is all related to future projections of productivity and efficiency and new business and et cetera. So it's related to what is that company's going to do in the future. So if you are sitting there saying, well, we should actually divest because they're going to do the same and the future is going to be, well, the future of all these companies is dependent on how we are actively participating in those companies and showing them the better way to do business. So if you want to look at the benefit, a financial benefit of riding a wave of climate resilience, you want to invest and bring forward opportunities to companies that have the investable capital. So it's hard to look at, you can't look at this in a static state. You have to also remember that invested capital will grow in the future. If you look at Exxon and the impact of engine number one, which we won't know for years. We might not know for a decade how impactful that would be, but we do know that capital infused into climate resilient technologies will not only be good for moral reasons in the climate, but that could actually be financially beneficial. I mean, look at the solar industry. I mean, 10 years ago, people said you won't get panels cheaper. Every single year, they've been halved in price, halved and halved and halved. So it's all about innovation. And I think that's one of the reasons it's all for me about technology innovation, where you put the money or keep the money, where you think that there's the capital that the entities that can put that capital to work. So I'm on a little bit of a tangent, but I just was responding to the comment that inferred it's a static decision.
Thank you. Other questions? I gotta do steps. Oh, here we go. Where do I stop?
Thank you. So my question is, how can one make a difference as a stockholder? Because you said that the stockholders had the chance to make their imprints in the fossil fuel industry and organize the commencement of change. And then my second follow-up to that is there a chance of UW-Madison, I know we're not specifically talking about UW-Madison, but is there a chance of UW-Madison taking a stand in their current practices and instead of divesting, taking their place and doing this instead?
Anyone? Me? Martha? Again, Martha, you go.
I'll take it again. Sorry. It's a really, really good question. There's multiple ways. First, we've got board activism. That's one way a shareholder, where we talked about that engine number one. Secondly is divestment. Third is voting your share. And like I said earlier, a lot of individual investors who have a share in a company, get their voting in their email, like, no, I'm not going to vote, whatever. So actually just voting your share. A lot of ESG initiatives are coming to the corporate boardroom level, and that you have an opportunity to vote. Thirdly, that isn't talked about enough. I heard a woman named Naomi Oreskes, I think is her name.
Orestes, yeah.
Thank you. She's got an awesome podcast, and one that I heard the other day. And one of the things she said, which I firmly believe in, that is positive lobbying. She said she talked to some of the politicians on Capitol Hill, and they said, when these concepts of divestment and climate change come up, the oil companies are coming to us and telling us the one side, but there's not a lot of positive lobbying happening. And as a shareholder, even an individual shareholder can be sending letters to politicians and saying, I own a share in this company and I support it in a way that there are actually good things that are happening. I get plastics for healthcare, but plastics for healthcare are actually from petrochemicals. So she actually says it slightly differently. She says that you can be positive about environment, the environment, like how oil companies are being degraded in the environment, but you can also say it from the positive of supporting initiatives that a company is doing going forward. How you can make climate change a positive for a shareholder. So I think there's 4 or 5 ways you can have an influence as a shareholder. And I forgot the second part of that question, sorry.
Shall we pass on? I think I do remember the second part. It was relating to what the foundation could do to be an active shareholder, or like as an active owner. And I don't want to speak for the foundation. I think they will have to speak for themselves there. And I'm also not enough of a finance person. I know it might be easier if you are a direct shareholder, if you own directly shares in companies as opposed to investing through mutual funds. At the same time, I don't know that it's impossible if you are investing through mutual funds to take an active role. I think to the extent that a shareholder like the foundation sees that the market is changing such that oil companies for their financial health have to invest more in renewable energies, for example, like build robust investments there. They will probably, as a shareholder, voice that because it is in their best interest that those companies they're investing in perform well. And as we are transitioning into a cleaner economy, those traditional
fossil fuel companies to stay relevant have to invest in those renewable energies. So I think they probably, again, play an active role to the extent that it makes sense from an economic perspective there, that it's in the best interest of the firm to do that. And I think this is what happened with Exxon, that it was actually, that's why BlackRock and everyone signed up and voted for those directors that Engine Number One had put forward, because they all felt that Exxon had not invested sufficiently into renewable energies, and it was going to come to the detriment of the company. And so as a shareholder, you have an interest to, for that company to step up their investments in that energy. There were more questions up there. Are they still relevant? I still have my own question.
I guess my question was kind of similar to the last one on the Zoom, but like if you view divestment as kind of solely a symbolic action, like depending on the level of involvement you have, I just think at what point does kind of awareness and symbolism become kind of, I guess I don't know how to say it, but like I think people who are aware of climate change and who believe in it, which you should, are like aware of the causes and effects. And so at what point does awareness become kind of irrelevant in that sense, or like symbolism? Does that make sense?
I can take this. I think that the symbolic value of divesting is, it still holds value because it shows us that like we can do something about it. Like even if it is a very small thing, like divestment is still an action that is happening, and it's important to like, I guess like, it's important that we continue to like take part in these symbolic actions, because like while we do know that like climate change is real and it is important, like it's hard to feel like we have control over anything, because we as individuals are like just don't have impacts on like the like way climate change is going, or like it feels like we as individuals don't have control over the way that climate change is going to happen. But like when we do have these smaller actions, like that drives our ability to keep going, and like every small win is a win, and like every small step that we take towards like avoiding climate change matters. And I think that like when we dismiss something as just symbolic, like that is like that's a very like nihilistic way of looking at it, and it's very like we can't, if we don't have hope and if we don't believe that what we're doing has an impact, then like we're not going to try and we're not going to do anything. So that's why like divestment is important, I think. Sorry if that doesn't answer the question or doesn't answer it in the way that's proper to this panel, but
Both Steph and I are being for a response. So we want to both say something. Steph, you go.
Okay, so I want to push back from this dichotomy between symbolism and substantive stuff, because it's all a process that works together. For example, in other areas where I've talked about environmental justice organizing, a lot of lawsuits have been brought out that everyone knew from the beginning were not going to work out, right? So in that sense, it's symbolic, right? Because they knew they weren't going to win. They didn't have the legal standards for it or anything. But by being able to place that in the news, it allowed for more on-the-ground organizing. And so a lot of these kinds of flows of organizations are just as divestment isn't a one-off kind of decision. The role of activism isn't a one-off decision. And you can use certain types of actions as leverage points to reach other types of actions. For example, with divestment, even though I drafted the divestment conclusion resolution, mostly to get in the procurement thing, I've been invited to a number of shows where I talked about divestment and got to talk about procurement. And people are like, whoa, we haven't really thought about procurement. And that allows for more substantive education to happen if you focus on using these things as leverage points rather than just symbol or not symbol. You can use them as leverage points.
One reaction that I had in terms of where do we have power? Where can we feel powerful? Personally, I feel we are powerful in our own personal choices. We have complete control over, do we get on this bike or do we drive the car or things like that, you know, in your personal life and our personal choices of consumption. That's where I feel we have power and can exercise that as consumers. To some extent, I understand that we are also sort of held hostage a little bit in the energy system that was built, but there's room for choices. That was my reaction to where do we have power here. Other questions?
So we've talked a lot about this difference between symbolic action and active participation in, you know, being a shareholder or a stockholder in these different companies. But I'd like to, and perhaps this is a bit more of a philosophical question, or maybe not even a question at all, but if we think about the university as a company, and we think about a university, not our university, perhaps you might want to think about it like that. But if we think about a university with its own shareholders, those are the students and the faculty and the staff that work and come to a campus. They are the customers. They are the ones that have a say. And if they are pushing for something, is there not somewhat of a moral obligation to answer to our quote unquote stakeholders, or those that care about what we are doing as a company, and think about it as a little more of a microcosm of an economy? And in that same vein, it's also a way to attract quote unquote shareholders. For example, the Princeton Review analyzing new incoming freshmen has found year after year that sustainability, climate change, and the like are one of the top 5 determining factors of where a student decides to go to school. And we have started to see the tides turn a little bit on students' interest and where they decide to go to school based on that fact. So I think trying to get away from, you know, is this a symbolic gesture that is going to make headlines in the New York Times and move the needle worldwide? We need to maybe step back a little bit from that and think about it more as a place-based example of how do we move the needle and answer to the people that are asking for this locally? What movements can we make in symbolic actions can we take locally? It's kind of this idea of think globally, act locally. So I don't know if that was a question, but just kind of rattling around in my head. We haven't brought up the incoming students part tonight yet. Obviously that's, you know, the youth is the ones most affected.
I have some thoughts on that. So I think thinking that's the way I also like to think about it in my own head, is that this university is a company that needs to make money, and it needs to attract customers, which are students. And it's very clear that students care about climate change. It's very clear that students care about fossil fuel use and that sort of thing. And so just on a purely logistical standpoint of this university operating, needing to make money, needing to have a budget and have a growing student population, if students are saying that we want divestment, we want clean energy, we want a future that is livable, the institution does have an obligation to listen to that, just because if they want students to come, then they need to listen to what students want. And so I have this article here about it's called The Mutual Reinforcement of Academic Reputation in Fossil Fuel Divestment. And it basically just proves that so by the end of 2020, 190 universities and colleges worldwide had publicly committed to divest partially or fully from fossil fuel holdings. And they found a statistical correlation between the status of universities in the world rankings and decisions to divest endowments from fossil fuels. So there's a direct correlation there between universities choosing to divest and their academic reputations. So yes.
I'm a social science researcher. Correlation is different to causation. Just want to point that out. So it could well be that there were some other factors that actually caused the increase in what was it, student enrollment? They did the control for that. I would have to, I will read it for sure. So was it a time series? Was it a time series? You haven't looked at it. I will actually look at it. Okay, we have Wait, I took your mic away. Go.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's a little bit laughable to sort of really separate, the UW Foundation from UW Madison. That it's not really how it works. It's our alumni. I'm graduating in a month, and when I start donating my dollars, they're going to go to, certain people in this room, versus, people that may otherwise, like my dollars as an alumni will go to the UW Foundation. Okay, it's not a separate entity. Now I'm going to pretty much draw directly from the UW Madison mission statement, which states, under the UW Madison mission, the mission of this university is to ensure the survival of this and future generations and improving the quality of life for all. Okay, like that is the mission of this university, and our investment arm, it should be directly abiding by that same mission. So those are a little bit of my closing thoughts there.
I've read that mission statement too. I interpret it in the context of creating a learning environment that ensures that. We should probably also read the mission statement of the foundation. I'm not fast enough on my phone to pull that up. We have 3 minutes left. Maybe what we will do is leave it with the question that I have and probably not answer it because we don't have time. But so the question I have, I was asked once by someone, what would actually happen, or it was a concern, what would happen? Imagine we all do divest. And somehow all democracies divest. What would be the remaining regimes that control energy? It would be, to the largest extent, autocratic regimes, I believe. And that assumes now that actually divestment does anything. But that's disconcerting, no?
Yes, that's like a pretty big hypothetical situation. But I mean, it's the fact that, divesting from fossil fuel heavily dependent companies, that doesn't prevent you from reinvesting in clean energy companies and clean energy projects. And there's like literally countless areas in which clean energy is trajectory like much higher than the status quo. So I think, these big oil and gas conglomerates would be, I guess, theoretically being held by people that are like, who cares, and like want to extract the value from these companies. But there's not really much being done currently that prevents them from doing so already. And I think, it's the same argument of, we can reinvest our dollars elsewhere in the clean energy environment as well.
Also reducing our demand at the same time of fossil fuels.
Converging to that point. No, we're converging to a point where renewable energy is just as viable, just as economical, and relative to traditional energy sources. And then when you factor in that additional component of, how is the Earth left by, using one source versus the other, there's a very clear answer. So yes, as technology continues to improve year after year, we are approaching a point where renewable energy sources are going to be the predominant energy source of our economy in the world. And I think UW-Madison as an institution can be on the forefront of that through their investment dollars.
I think it's fitting that we leave the last word with the class president for 2022. So it is 8:30. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nathan, for putting this on against all odds. We've tried for 3 years. It happened. Thank you all, and have a lovely evening. If there are questions, I'm sure, Nathan, you're available if there are questions in terms of the papers that you mentioned or other sources that we've been drawing on. I'm sure we'd all be willing to share some there. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you for having me. Sorry I couldn't make it. Nice to meet you all.
Bye.
Bye.